Thank you so much for coming. And we have come all the way to number 14 in our user manual for humans. We've talked a lot about chiropractic and brain and nutrition and so forth. But as you know, in this office, we want to address health at its core. And what gets in the way of health is called stress, and stress comes in three ways primarily. It comes as structural, chemical, and emotional stress. And emotional is maybe the most important source of stress of all of those. And yet it's maybe the hardest one to tackle because it requires so much of the individual. But today we will venture further into this, into our understanding of how all this works and how it happens, where does emotional stress come from. And a major source of stress is the ego, and we will try to explain a little bit more and put the ego in perspective today. So first we'll talk about how the brain develops. We will talk about what neural networks are, what the ego is, and even if this is not the classical psychology definition of ego, we don't really care. We just want, I'll present one version just so we can have something to talk about. What are some of the advantages of the ego? Why do we have one? Why do we need one? And what are some of the shortcomings? Why is it good to not identify completely with it? And finally, as this title implies, happiness, that how do all of these concepts affect your happiness and your quality of life? So my favorite little poem here, it will mean a lot more after the lecture, but we'll start with it and then you can go back to it. And we've had this once before, but it's so good we have to have it again. I have a little robot that goes around with me. I tell him what I'm thinking, I tell him what I see. I tell my little robot all my hopes and fears. He listens and remembers all my joys and tears. At first, my little robot followed my command, but after years of training, he's gotten out of hand. He doesn't care what's right or wrong, or what is false or true. No matter what I try now, he tells me what to do. So file that away, we'll come back to it. For those who have seen a lot of the seminars, that probably starts to make a little more sense by now. So how does all this start? How does the brain work? How does it develop? Well, a baby is born with about 100 billion neurons, and that baby brain weighs about 12 ounces. And then by the time that we get to be adults, the brain still only has 100 billion neurons, or maybe a few less. If we've had a couple of parties and we hit our heads a few times. But it weighs 48 ounces, we hope.
I hope.
So it's increased 4 times in weight, but it has the same number of brain cells. So what's the difference? What happened? Well, the baby brain is born with all the cells, but the cells are not very well connected. They have some connections for basic life support, but they haven't developed much skills, they haven't developed much habits, they haven't developed any beliefs. So what happens is this baby, it starts to interact with its environment. It starts to receive information, it starts to move, it starts to do things. And by a process of trial and error and reward, the baby starts to repeat certain patterns that are rewarding, such as you dip your hand into food and you aim for the face, and if you hit the mouth, it's rewarding because you get a bite of what you wanted. If you hit someplace else, it's less rewarding. So over time, you fine-tune the pathways that fire the appropriate behavior. And what is that behavior? It's a coordination. It's certain brain cells connecting to other brain cells, firing off a specific pattern called a neural network. And every time that pattern fires, it produces the same type of behavior, which is a desired motion. So over time, we make so many of these connections that the connections actually make the brain weigh 4 times more. So each of these 100 billion neurons can make as many, on average, about 10,000 connections. So you imagine the complexity of these neural networks. And on the right, on the next slide, we see some neural networks. And these are actual individual brain cells. These are called Purkinje cells that live in the cerebellum. And they can have as many as 300 to 400,000 connections. And the cerebellum is one of those areas that are just interconnected with everything that happens in the body. Whether it's movement or thought, it's all regulated and controlled from there. So when a function or skill is executed, so we talked about the baby and the movement, then a specific neural network or several neural networks in combination are fired off. So this holds true if we're walking or playing piano or hammering or juggling. Those are movements and skills. But it also holds true for blinking or focusing your eye or salivating or sneezing. None of those things happen by themselves. Secreting stomach acid after a meal, sexual arousal for procreation, appreciating music, that's a learned skill. And it's cultural. We don't appreciate the same music they do in India or in South America. So what we think is a pure musical scale sounds awful to them, and vice versa. It is learned behavior. We're firing off certain patterns, certain combinations of brain cells. Getting annoyed with traffic is a learned skill. It may come as a surprise to you, but the traffic is actually not annoying. It is your interpretation of it that's annoying, that makes it annoying to you. Rude people in traffic, judging someone's behavior as stupid. Every time that you point something out in the world or in your environment that you say, oh, well, it shouldn't be like that, they're doing it wrong, they're stupid, they're inadequate, they're whatever, you're making a judgment that's a learned response. Understanding, getting the punchline of a joke, that's a learned behavior. So all of these aspects that make us, that make up the very humanity that we are, they are learned behaviors. They are neural networks, and we fire them off, and there's triggers in the environment, and there's things that we find funny, and there's things that we find annoying, but it's all learned and it's all networks. And where do most of these networks come from? Where does it start? Well, basically we want to liken this to downloading programs. And for different stages of development, we have different dominant brain frequencies. So a baby has mostly what's called delta and theta frequencies. Those are very low frequencies, from 0 up to about 8 hertz. And those are the brain frequencies that we use when we sleep. And babies sleep 23 hours a day and wake up to eat, basically, and then they sleep the rest. So those brain waves are appropriate for that segment of life. Then as they start waking up and interacting, they shift and they use less of the delta and they use more of theta and alpha. And they're still low frequencies, and these brainwave frequencies are basically pure download frequencies. The kids before age of 6, they're like a blank slate, or they're like a computer with a blank hard drive, if you will. And their keyboard is all their senses and their exposure to the world, and everybody gets to type on the keyboard and type in whatever they want into that hard drive, because at that age, with those brain frequencies, the baby, the child, has no judgment of what's right or wrong or whether it's appropriate. They're just downloading, just pure download. So by the time we're 6, we have virtually all of our programs already established. And that's a part of learning. That's part of becoming human and functioning in a society. So kids have something called mirror behavior. There's even mirror neurons. And what they do is they look at their parents to download the interpretation of what happens. So if you watch this, it's really kind of funny. You see a little kid stumble and fall, and before they start crying, they look up and see where is mommy, and they look at mommy's face to see what is the expression. Is it one of horror or is it one of delight? And if it's one of horror, then the child mimics that and starts crying. But if it's one of delight, the kid gets up and keeps playing. And this is how they learn what things mean. So if there's a snake crawling through the backyard and mommy goes, "Oh my God, terrible, it's dangerous, get away," you've just programmed that behavior. But if mommy says, "Oh, how about that? That one's not very dangerous. Let's come take a look." Now you program a completely different behavior. So think about that next time you see a kid fall and notice what's happening. And the famous joke is the little kid that falls and then someone watches from the side and says, "Oh, well, you fell, why aren't you crying?" And the kid says, "I didn't know anybody was home." So, but there's a lot of truth to that, and that is just how, that's human. That's how we form most of our behavior. And just programming. So even some other things that we consider universally true that we don't think about, they're mostly learned. So things like social behavior and courtesy, what we consider rude or nice or gross. People in this country don't eat many bugs, yet in other cultures, bugs are delicacies. They go pick the termites and the ants and they crunch them up and they can't wait because they're tasty to them. Our reactions to what's good or bad news. Shakespeare said 400 years ago that there's no such thing as good or bad, only our thinking makes it so. So all those things are learned behaviors. And beliefs on basically every matter. What's important, what's fun, what's frightening, what's worrisome, all those are things we learn. And what's important to understand now is that the more often a neural network is activated, the stronger it gets, the more likely it is to fire off in the future. We know this principle, we've talked about it before, use it or lose it. It holds true for muscles, it holds true for bones, it holds true for individual brain cells, and it holds true for patterns of brain cells, pathways and networks of brain cells. So beliefs are neural networks. So beliefs are nothing more than thoughts that you've been thinking a lot. It's a practiced thought. And if you have a belief system that you don't like, if you have a belief that doesn't serve you, if you understand this, then you can change it. Beliefs are not written in stone. If you don't like it, get another one. On the downside of that is that the more you practice negative thoughts, the more things you find to feel negative about. And the practiced patterns that we have, they become our most global belief, the most fundamental, the widest, broadest belief, and that is how we see the world. So the question is, when you think about the world, when you think about society, when you think about politics and countries and the state of the world and economy and environment, do you think of it primarily as good or do you think of it primarily as bad? And if you do, who told you? And most people get a lot of their beliefs from news. And news are not a good representation of what's happening in the world, because they focus, if there's a million things happening, they're going to find the worst, and they're going to show you the worst. Even though there were 999,000 and some good things happen, that's not newsworthy, so they're not going to tell you. So because they're selecting such a narrow slice of the world for you, they strongly influence how you feel about the world, and that becomes your basic feeling, how good you feel, and how you get on how much you get out of life on a regular basis. Another concept, another way of looking at this, we talked about it as the hard drive. We type in things for the little kid. Well, all of our beliefs and all of our programs are like a tape player. And if you record something on a tape player, the tape player is not going to judge whether it's good or bad for you. It's not going to judge whether it's right or wrong. It's not going to decide whether it's true or false. If you push the button, it's going to play the record. And if you push the button on your recordings inside, they're just going to play. And there's no judgment or evaluation of whether this serves you, or whether it's true, or whether it's used to be true or no longer true. It really doesn't matter. So neural networks basically behave like a tape player. And of course, it doesn't help to get mad at the tape player. If you notice something that you're doing is like, darn, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep believing this? Why do I keep reacting and acting? Why do I feel this way? Well, that anger, that upset, you're being angry at a tape player. So just understand how it works, and then we can start talking about how to change it. So now we'll move into what we call the ego. And for more references on this, my favorite source for this material is a guy called Eckhart Tolle. So if you want to learn more, he's probably the best source that I've seen. He wrote a book called A New Earth, and there's a lot of good material on that. So basically the ego is the sum total of all your thoughts and the beliefs that you call I. And this is a different way of looking at things than most people think. And as modern human beings, we have about, they've estimated, somebody walked around and counted their thoughts and said, oh, well, we have about 60,000 thoughts a day. And then you realize how many of those thoughts are the same today as they were yesterday. They're repeating. So thinking doesn't really serve much purpose, it's just reiterating. And most of that are thoughts that you identify with. The thoughts become who you are, and that is essentially what and who the ego is. But the ego is not who you are. The ego is a program. You are not your thoughts, you have your thoughts. And this gives you a false sense of self because you identify with these things that aren't truly who you are. Then when you, to the extent that you identify with them, then they become you. So this is part of our language, for example. We don't say, I have a happy thought. We say, I am happy. And on the reverse, we say, I am angry. We don't say, I have an angry thought, or I am reacting in an angry way, which would be more appropriate. When we say, I am angry, that thought, that state takes us over and we become it. So, what else does the ego do? The ego gains a sense of value. It expands its value by identifying with things. So, if you have a nice shiny car and you feel good about the car, then your ego attaches itself and identifies with the car, and all of those properties of the car it brings onto you, onto itself. And if it's a car that you can be proud of, something that's better than somebody else's, then you feel superior and the ego feels enlarged and the ego gains strength. The flip side of this is that the ego has no value in itself. The ego only finds value in comparison with other things. Another thing with the ego is that it's addicted to having more. Because it only has value through identification with things, then as soon as it has something, then that's old news and it's going to want something else. It's going to want more. So therefore, the ego becomes addicted to more, and this becomes a very short-term gratification, because you go for years and you dream about that new TV, that new car, that new house, but as soon as you have it, then you start looking, well, who's got a better one? Who's got a bigger one? So it's not that the ego is incapable of enjoying the present. It only enjoys looking forward or by comparing. So the only way you can compare what you have is by comparing it to someone else and say, oh, well, they have less. So because of this, the ego also cannot stand the present moment. The ego gains its value from attaching to things by identifying with things. So in this present moment, here is all there is, but somewhere else, some other time, some other place, holds the promise of something better, something that can raise the value of the ego. So therefore, the ego it hates the present moment. It always looks into the future or into the past, but never now. And because of that, if you identify with the ego, that's where you get this sense of restlessness, where you're never satisfied with where you are. You're always looking back to try to remember something good, or you're looking forward to hope for something better. What are some things that strengthen the ego? The number one thing is having more than. So we've covered that. Having more money, having more education, having more property, having more brand labels, having more toys. Then you can identify with those and feel superior because someone else has less. Knowing more than. This could be that you have a better education than someone else, or it could be that you know a secret, that you come across some gossip that the neighbor lady doesn't know yet. Then your ego is strengthened because you have something, okay? Being morally superior. Now this is funny because you can actually, the ego is also strengthened if you are, let's say, if you disavow all property, if you give up all property and you live a pious life for some higher purpose, then you strengthen yourself in the belief that you are morally superior by giving up all these things, but it's still ego. You're still separating your own uniqueness even though you're having less. So the ego is always doing this comparison and trying to find some aspect of where you're different. So if everybody has $1 million home, then you're going to be different if you have a little cottage. Okay? Being unique, being a martyr, being proud, patriotism, all of these things depend on the ego. So for example, patriotism, and the next one is related, us versus them. If you don't create patriotism, which is ego, and if you don't create a sense of us versus them, then you can't start a war. So before they start a war, they have to make very, very sure that they have created this separation and this difference in level where we are right and they are wrong. And now it's okay. Now we're morally justified to start a war. Being right. How many would rather be right than happy? You've heard that one. That's the ego. That's the ego. We get so involved with something that we don't care, that we're not recognizing that the purpose, the point, the justification for continuing the argument is long, long gone. We just have to prove a point. We got to get the last word in. And in that, you're not making yourself happy, you're not making the other person happy. Nothing is gained because the ego has taken over and it wants to strengthen itself by being right. Being angry, same thing. Blaming, complaining. Every single aspect of complaint If you complain about the weather, if you complain about the traffic, if you complain how late it is, how stupid people are, why they do this, you are stating how you are being right and the thing you're complaining about is wrong. That's strengthening ego. And we do this even if we're complaining about the rain. Okay, no one's going to do anything about it, obviously, but if we complain about it, then obviously we are right and the weather is wrong. Okay? Making wrong, laying on guilt, unforgiveness, revenge, all of those things, they go hand in hand with what we just talked about. And also ego, like we said, the ego cannot exist in the present moment. The ego is thought, and as such, it can only find strength in the past or the future. Because in the present, there's nothing to hold on to except beingness. So in the past, it holds on to all the great deeds that you did in the past, and in the future, all the great things you're going to do. So here's the time for my little disclaimer. This is the official disclaimer. Just because I have some strong opinions doesn't mean I agree with everything I say. So just in case you find something to complain about at the end here. So why do we have an ego in the first place? Well, the ego is there for survival. The ego is what gives us the desire, and with desire comes the drive, and with the drive comes, like we said, survival. So if you don't have an ego, if you have no preferences, if you don't want anything, then you're just sitting there. You don't even care about food. And there are some people who get into such deep meditative states that they're just totally blissful. They don't care. They can pass on or they can stay. It doesn't really matter. So when you totally disengage the ego, you can't stay around very long. And it also provides a lot of automation, so we don't have to think about every step. But we need to find some balance, because the ego also has a lot of disadvantages. The number one is that the ego is completely unconscious. The ego isn't aware of anything. So because of that, you're very, very limited in how much joy and peace and happiness that you can experience. Because with the ego, you cannot get into a genuine, peaceful, or joyous state. Because it all depends, with the ego, it all depends on comparison. And as soon as you have something, you want something else. And because the ego misses the now, it really misses out on life completely. Because the now, this moment, is all there is. There's never been anything outside of this moment. Because now is this moment, and 5 minutes from now, when we experience that time, that will also be now. So if we're present in the moment, then we are aware of where we are and what's going on. But thought connects backwards and forwards in time, and so does the ego. But true peace and joy is only present right here and now. And with the ego and with thought, we just can't experience that. So what's the main problem with the ego is, from a health perspective and from a joy perspective, is because of everything that we discussed, the ego is the main source of stress in life. And as we talked about on other seminars, other videos, stress is what gets in the way of health. It's the number one thing that gets in the way of your body, the natural healing ability of your body. Some more ego characteristics. The ego is composed of thought. So those never-ending thoughts that race around in your head, we're on 16. That's the ego. The endless judging and evaluating and justifying. And you probably recognize what I'm talking about. that everything you have an opinion about, everything that you even think about or label, you're making an automatic judgment. And we're always racing around with our thoughts, justifying our behavior. Well, if he said this, I should have said that, and then we were playing these scenarios for some imaginary person. And that's all the ego, and it gets in the way of joy. So again, the ego isn't good or bad, it is simply unconscious. And because it's unconscious, to the extent that you identify with ego, you're missing out on life, on joy and peace and the present moment. The ego can only be happy for very, very short moments of time. And that's when you have the experience of getting something. You acquire something new, you win the lottery, you graduate, you get a new title, you get a new knowledge, you find something out. But those are very, very fleeting moments, and they're not the true joy. So, who are you? You are not the thought, you're the one who has the thought. And if you start relaxing and finding out where you're feeling the absolute best, when you're feeling absolutely, totally blissful, you learn to find that what you truly are in that state is just pure beingness. You have no opinions, you have no thoughts, and in that moment, that's as good as you can feel, basically. The ego, instead, is about doingness and havingness. So once you realize that you are not your thoughts and you are not your ego, then you can step back and you can watch your thoughts. You can watch the ego. And as soon as you can create that separation, that little bit of distance between yourself and what's happening, then you're not sucked in, and now you have disengaged the ego, and you become conscious, and you can start experiencing again. Some more ways of dissolving the ego is consciousness and awareness dissolves the ego. When you stop and question your thought, your behavior, or your reaction, that dissolves the ego. Meditation, the ability, the practice of stopping repetitious thoughts, dissolves the ego. When you make peace with the present moment. So, when you don't make peace with the present moment, you're basically arguing with what is. And whatever is, it is. There's no way to change it because it is what it is. And when you're arguing with it, when you want it to be any way different than what it is, you're arguing with reality, and you're not going to win that one. All right? And that's basically where most of stress and frustration comes from, is when you argue with what is. So, how do you do this? I've mentioned a few resources, books, tapes, discs, programs, videos, YouTube. The resources are endless. But commit yourself to sharpen your axe, and commit yourself to grow that consciousness, grow your ability to recognize what's going on, your awareness. So take 30 minutes a day to read and to listen and to grow. So we'll keep this brief and short, and if you have any questions at this point, we'll be happy to take those. And for next time, hope to see all of you back, and feel free to bring someone else who wants to know more about this. And if you have suggestions for topics, or if there's anything else that you'd like to know more about, let me know. Thank you.
Thank you.